In the village of Afari, a dark cloud hung over a beautiful young woman. The village, once filled with laughter and the vibrant colors of everyday life, had turned its back on her. Mothers dragged their sons in by their ears, warning them not to associate with her. Her peers avoided her, fearing that her bad luck might just rub off on them. People whispered behind closed doors, their words filled with fear and suspicion. They called her cursed, and for a good reason, they say. Every man who married her died on their wedding night. The villagers dragged her through the market square as she cried out in pain and anguish, her fragile voice lost in the loud chorus as they tore at the black mourning clothes she had worn for far too long, their anger visible for all to see. Burn her, she's a witch and must die, they shouted, their voices blending into a terrible chorus as they beat her with sticks and stones. Just as it seemed the villagers would carry out their cruel sentence, a stranger pushed through the crowd, asking the villagers to stop. His name was David. He was unlike anyone the villagers had ever seen before. His skin was pale, his eyes a deep blue like the ocean, and his hair was as golden as the sun. He was a white man, a tourist who had come to explore the wonders of Ghana. Everyone paused, startled by the stranger's interference. They stepped back, unsure of what to do. David knelt beside Anansewa, his eyes filled with concern as he gently helped her to her feet. Though her face was bruised and bloodied, there was a haunting innocence about her that refused to be overshadowed by her suffering. "Who are you?" he asked softly, his voice laced with empathy. "I am cursed," Anansewa whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Anyone who marries me dies on our wedding night." David's heart ached for her. He could see the deep sorrow in her eyes, the loneliness that had consumed her. But there was something else, something that stirred deep within him, an intense need to shield her from the village's cruelty. Anansewa had not always been a cursed bride. In fact, she had once been the pride of Afari. Afari was known for its abundance, with a sparkling stream flowing through it, filled with fishes and other creatures. But Afari's true gem was its enchanting women, celebrated and adored for their captivating beauty and graceful curves. Their radiant skin glowed like polished gemstones, and their elegant figures ignited passions in the heart of the men in Afari and neighboring villages, who would travel far and wide to catch a glimpse of these mesmerizing women, who were so captivating that stories about them was told by travelers privileged to have encountered them. Among these beauties, there was Anansewa, who stood out like a beacon of light. Her skin was as dark as cocoa, smooth as freshly churned milk, and her eyes were a light golden brown, like the last ray of the setting sun. When she smiled, it was as if the sun itself had descended to grace the earth, and the dimples that adorned her cheek made her even more enchanting. Her beauty was matched only by her kind heart, and she was loved and adored by many in the village, including her best friend, Efia. Efia was also a beautiful girl with a caramel complexion and a graceful figure, but even her beauty couldn't outshine the special allure that Anansewa had. Whenever they worked together, it was Anansewa who captured all the attention, leaving Efia in a shadow. Although the girls were as close as sisters, their personalities were worlds apart. Anansawa was quiet and reserved, and would do anything to please her friend. Efia, on the other hand, was as fiery and greedy as they come. She would shamelessly seduce men who she knew liked Anansewa, and would dump them once they begin to show interest in her. She was quick to confront anyone who gossiped about her, and lashed out at the slightest provocation. This attitude made some of the suitors hesitant to approach her. While Anansewa was gentle with her suitors, always careful not to hurt their feelings, she would turn them down with a smile, adding a light-hearted joke to soften the blow. Efia, on the other hand, was a will with a fiery determination. She had no patience for men who did not meet her standards, and she made sure they knew it. With sharp words, she would pick apart their flaws, sometimes loudly embarrassing them. If that didn't work, She would grab a bucket of water, drenching them to chase them off, and she wasn't shy about threatening more if they dared to persist. Anansewa and Efia were undeterred by the attention they received. Anansewa longed for a love that went beyond appearances, a love that would be as rare and unforgettable as a tale never told before. Efia too craved a deep connection, but her dream came with a twist. She wanted it wrapped in luxury and wealth, a love story that sparkled with the finest things in life. As the girls made their way back from the village stream, their prayers seemed to be answered. They noticed a group of women gathered together, giggling and smiling shyly. Efia, ever the curious one, couldn't resist finding out what was happening. With a playful grin, she tugged at Anansewa's arm, urging her to come along. Despite Anansewa's reluctance, Efia dragged her through the crowd, impatiently pushing past the other women. The angry sneers and the hisses didn't faze Efia. She was determined to uncover the source of the commotion. When they finally reached the front of the crowd, the girls were stunned by the sight before them. Their breath caught in their throats as they laid eyes on the stranger. Standing before them was the most handsome man they had ever seen. His name was Anan, a newly arrived rattan merchant who had come to settle in Afari. Anan was a sight to behold, tall with a strong muscular build and skin as rich and dark as the midnight sky. His very presence commanded attention and respect, and his smile, as bright as the clouds, sent waves of shy giggles through the women around him. Surrounded by admiring women, Anan tried to make his escape, but his eyes fell on the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. Anansewa stood beside Efia, her beauty captivating him instantly. Her dark skin shimmering like cocoa under the bright sun, and her light golden brown eyes sparkled with a captivating glow. Anansewa, feeling the intensity of his gaze, quickly looked away, her heart fluttering with a mix of shyness and something she couldn't quite place. Unnerved by his piercing stare, she grabbed Efia's hand and pulled her away from the circle. Eager to escape the weight of his attention, the two girls hurried home, their water pots balanced on their heads, but Anan's gaze remained fixed on Anansewa as she walked away. Her graceful movements itched in his mind. In that moment, he knew he had found someone special, someone his heart had been unknowingly searching for. As the girls walked home, Efia's excitement was palpable. "I have found the man of my dreams," she gushed, her voice filled with the thrills of infatuation. She started spinning tales of locking eyes with Anan, already imagining a future with him by her side, complete with children and a happy home. Days passed and Anan quickly established himself in the village, setting up a rattan art business that became an instant favorite among the women of Afari. Efia's meeting with him would dress in her finest kente clothes, adorned with beads and intricate patterns, just to visit his shop every morning. She even made it a habit to visit his home, bringing him breakfast before the others arrived and dinner after the market had closed for the day. However, while Efia sought Anan's affection, Anan's mind was consumed by thoughts of Anansewa. Every word he learned about her from Efia only deepened his fascination. He would pass by Anansewa's house, hoping to catch a glimpse of her, and sometimes he would stop to chat with her, offering small gifts and lending a hand when he could. He helped her fill her water pot, tilling her farm, and found any excuse to be by her. There was something about her quiet strength and her grace that captivated him in ways he couldn't fully understand. Gradually, these small gestures began to warm Anansewa's heart, and she found herself developing feelings for Anan. But she kept her distance, afraid of hurting Efia, whose affection for him only seemed to grow. The more Efia gushed about Anan, the more Anansewa's heart ached, torn between her budding love and her loyalty to her friend. As Anan's affection for Anansewa deepened, his friendship with Efia grew as well. Efia was always around, offering to help with household chores and market errands, eager to be of service to the man she believed was falling for her. But one sunny afternoon, while Efia was visiting Anan's store, he decided to confide in her, his voice steady yet hesitant. Efia, I have a bit of a dilemma, he began, catching her attention. There's someone I care for deeply, someone whose company I cherish, but I'm afraid she might only see me as a friend, and I don't want to risk our friendship by asking her to be my wife. Efia's heart raced as she listened, convinced that he was speaking about her. Encouraging him with all the hope in her heart, she urged him to take the leap and propose to the woman in question, assuring him that she might feel the same way about him. Relieved and encouraged by her words, Anan thanked Efia, joyfully hugging her as she left. Efia, brimming with newfound hope, hurried straight to Anansewa's house to share the news. Anan is going to propose to me, she exclaimed the moment she burst into Anansewa's room. Anansewa, though feeling a pang of disappointment and sorrow, embraced her friend, genuinely expressing her happiness. Despite the growing feeling she had for Anan, Anansewa was ready to set them aside for the sake of her friend's happiness. That night, after Efia left, Anansewa cried herself to sleep, her heart heavy with the burden of unspoken words. The following evening, as Anansewa and Efia were walking back from the village stream, Anan gathered the courage to finally express his feelings. With sincerity in his heart, he approached the two friends and gently pulled Anansewa aside, surprising both girls and visibly disappointing Efia. His voice trembled slightly as he poured out his heart, asking Anansewa to be his wife. Anansewa's eyes widened in shock. She hadn't expected this. Her thoughts immediately flew to Efia, who had been convinced that Anan was going to propose to her. How could she even consider accepting his proposal when her friend's heart was clearly set on him? A wave of guilt and uncertainty washed over Anansewa as she glanced towards Efia, who stood nearby, her water pot perfectly balanced on her head. Efia's body trembled with anger. Her shoulders tensed as hot tears spilled from her eyes, despite her efforts to hold them back. Without uttering another word, Efia turned and stormed off, leaving Anansewa standing alone with Anan, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on her heart. Caught in the storm of her emotions, torn between her love for Anan and her loyalty to her friend Efia, Anansewa couldn't find the words to respond. Instead, she silently turned and walked away, leaving Anan standing in confusion and disappointment. As she walked, her eyes caught sight of Efia, rushing ahead. Her heart pounded as she fled towards home, her mind a battlefield of conflicting emotions. Efia's words seemed to have shattered around her. The man she had secretly cherished, the one she had woven dreams of a future with, had chosen her best friend instead. The betrayal cut deep, a mix of anger and sorrow, swelling within her. She struggled to hold back the tears, to keep the pieces of her heart from crumbling completely. Yet as she hurried home, her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, and it felt as though the ground beneath her feet was slipping away. Could he? She hissed, her eyes blazing with fury. She's my best friend. How could he pick her over me? Efia stood in front of her house, trembling with emotions, mind racing. The hurt was too much to bear, and at that moment, Anansewa, who had finally caught up with her, tapped on her shoulder from behind. "Are you okay?" Anansewa asked her friend, genuinely concerned. "How can I be okay, Anansewa? You knew I liked him, didn't you? Yet you threw yourself at him like a cheap piece of clothing that you are." Efia spat out at her angrily. Anansewa, surprised at her friend's outburst, opened her mouth to speak, but Efia wouldn't let her speak. "Just shut up, Anansewa. Shut up, for Christ's sake. Enough with the pretense." Efia snapped, her voice trembling with anger. "You always find a way to show that you're better than me. For once in your life, couldn't you just let me have him?" "Well, there you go, you win, Anansewa. Anan your trophy awaits." With that, she stormed into her house, slamming the door behind her, leaving Anansewa standing outside, shocked and heartbroken by her friend's outbursts. Days passed, and Efia continued to ignore Anansewa, all while relentlessly visiting Anan, despite his clear confession that it was Anansewa he truly wanted. After enduring many days of rejection, Efia finally reached her breaking point. Realizing the fruitlessness of her efforts, she approached Anansewa, her heart heavy with regret. With tears-filled eyes, she apologized for her behavior, humbly asking Anansewa's forgiveness. Anansewa, with her kind heart and her forgiving nature, embraced the fear warmly, her voice soft with sincerity as she apologized as well. Days later, the village buzzed with excitement as news of Anansewa and Anan's upcoming marriage spread like wildfire. Everyone threw themselves into the wedding preparation, including Efia and Anansewa, though the once warm friendship between them had grown cold. Unspoken tension lingered between them, a sense of unease that both hoped time would heal, bringing things back to the way they were. The wedding day finally arrived, and it was a grand celebration. The villagers gathered in joyous anticipation, their hearts brimming with happiness as they sang and danced for the newlyweds. Anansewa and Anan seemed lost in their own world of love, their happiness radiating like the sun, shining brightly for all to see. But that night, tragedy struck with a cruel hand. As Anansewa lay beside her new husband, a deep unease settled over her. Something was terribly wrong. She reached out to Anan, only to find his breathing had grown shallow, and before she could even cry out, he was gone, dead on their wedding night. The village, which had been filled with joy just hours before, was now drowned in sorrow. Anansewa, shattered and heartbroken, could only cling to her grief as the villagers, equally stunned, offered her condolences. No one could understand the sudden tragedy, leaving everyone in a state of helpless confusion. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Anansewa's grief remained a heavy burden on her heart. The villagers pitied her, but life moved on, and eventually so did she. Though the pain lingered, Anansewa could not deny the love that once warmed her soul, and slowly she allowed herself to hope again. When a brave suitor named Malik asked for her hand in marriage, Anansewa agreed, praying that this time would be different. But on their wedding day, tragedy struck again. Malik collapsed and died in her arms, leaving the village in chaos as whispers of the curse began to spread. Soon the people started to distance themselves from Anansewa, calling her Anansewa the cursed bride. Amidst the fear and isolation, only Efia stood by her side, offering unwavering support and comfort. She fended off the naysayers, refusing to abandon her friend. But the same fate befell Anansewa's third and fourth husbands. By the time she had buried 4, the village was in an uproar. No man would dare to marry her now, and Anansewa was shunned and condemned to a life of mourning. The once beautiful, cheerful woman became a ghost of her former self, her eyes hollow, and her spirit broken. It seemed her fate was sealed, and she resigned herself to a life of loneliness and solitude. The village, which had once admired her, now avoided her like a plague. After learning about Anansewa's tragic situation, David was filled with newfound knowledge and a determination to restore pride and dignity. David vowed to help her no matter the cost. Efia, observing the growing closeness between David and Anansewa from afar, was torn between shock and disbelief, and eventually she tried to warn David. "You must be careful," she said, her voice trembling. "There are things you do not understand. Our traditions are not to be meddled with." But David would not listen. He was determined to unravel the misery behind the curse, and nothing would stop him. He proposed an unusual plan, a fake wedding between them. Anansewa, however, was horrified by the idea. The thought of losing another man, even in a pretend marriage, was too much for her to bear. But David was determined. He pleaded with Anansewa, assuring her that their wedding would be different, that he wouldn't become her next victim. Despite her fears, Anansewa eventually agreed to the fake wedding. News of their impending marriage spread like wildfire through the village. Whispers of Anansewa, the so-called cursed bride, and her newfound victim reached every corner. Villagers approached David, sharing tales of Anansewa's tragic past and warning him to stay away. But he refused to listen. The villagers didn't hold back in confronting Anansewa either. They warned her of the doom that awaited her if she went through with the marriage, promising that she wouldn't escape their wrath if David met the same fate as her previous husbands. Efia, who was unaware of the secret plan between Anansewa and David, also sat down with her friend, urging her to reconsider. But Anansewa, like David, had made up her mind. She was determined to marry him, leaving Efia with no other choice than to stand by her despite her fears. On the day of the fake wedding, Anansewa and Efia followed tradition, preparing the food for the supposed wedding night. After delivering the food to David, Efia returns to her home, leaving David and Anansewa alone. David gently took Anansewa's hand in his. His thought warm and reassuring. "We will uncover the truth tonight, Anansewa. No more running, no more hiding. We will face this together." That night, instead of eating the meal prepared for him, David followed through with his plan. He quietly fed it to a cage bird he had secretly acquired earlier that day. With Anansewa by his side in his small hut, they went to sleep, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on them. The next morning, Anansewa woke up in a panic, her heart pounding in her chest. She quickly shook David awake, terrified that he might have died during the night. But to her immense relief, David stared, his eyes open to meet hers, alive and well. Overcome with emotions, she embraced him tightly, feeling the weight of her dread slowly lifting. However, when her gaze drifted to the cage in the corner, her breath caught in her throat. The birds that had eaten the meal laid lifeless, confirming her worst fear. Something had been poisoning her husbands. David, already on his feet, met her gaze with a grim expression. The realization hung heavy between them, undeniable and chilling. As they stood there in stunned silence, a commotion erupted outside. The sound of wailing filled the air, growing louder as it neared the hut. Anansewa's heart raised as she recognized the voice. It was Efia. David opened the door just as Efia came into view, leading a crowd of villagers, tears streaming down her face as she cried out, "Anansewa's husband is dead. The curse has struck again." But when she saw David standing in the doorway, alive and well, her cries flattered, confusion replacing her grief. The villagers too stopped in their tracks, their eyes wide with disbelief. David stepped forward, holding up the dead bird for all to see. Anansewa's husbands didn't die from a curse, he declared, his voice strong and clear. They were poisoned, and tonight I have discovered the truth. The same Efia, who had always been the one to announce the death of Anansewa's husbands, now stood still, her face drained of color. David's voice remained firm as he accused her, revealing that it was she who had served the food that killed the bird and all of Anansewa's past husbands. Every gaze turned to Efia, who, despite the gravity of the moment, remained composed. "Yes, it was me," she spat, with no hint of remorse. "I am glad you finally know what it feels like to lose someone you love. It's exactly how I felt when Anan chose you over me. In fact, when all the other men always chose you over me." Gasps of disbelief echoed around them, and Anansewa's words seemed to crumble. Efia, her voice sharp with anger, admitted her jealousy. She confessed how deeply wounded she was when Anan, along with the others, had chosen Anansewa instead. The mere thought of Anansewa being seen as better had planted a seed of bitterness and jealousy in her heart that had grown into something dark and twisted. The villagers, who once admired and envied their friendship, now looked at them with a mix of anger, pity, and shock. The elders, who upheld the traditions and justice of Afari, stepped forward to pronounce judgment as the crowd began to chant for her banishment. As the repercussions of her actions sank in, tears began to flow down Efia's face. As she saw the villagers' angry faces, her spirit shattered. She had lost everything: her closest friend, her home, and any hope of redemption. Banished from Afari, Efia would spend the rest of her days in isolation, tormented by the ghost of her own choices. Anansewa, though deeply wounded by the betrayal, later found solace in the friendship and kindness of David. He had stood by her through her darkest moments, and together they started to rebuild their lives, finding strength in each other. Eventually, Anansewa and Davy decided to leave Afari behind, yearning for a fresh start. Far from the haunting shadows of their past, they journeyed to Davy's homeland, a place filled with bustling cities and endless opportunities. In this new land, they could finally live free from the pain and tragedy that once defined their lives.